Hello there, this is Fiona, host and main GM for What Am I Rolling, a twice-monthly RPG one-shot podcast. This is a bonus Q&A episode to tide us over to the next one-shot, and it is indeed a very special Q&A, as this week I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing game designer and illustrator Fede Sohns about their upcoming RPG, Zephyr, an anarchist fantasy game of fleeting identities. The Zephyr are the feelings of a living sentient landmass called Ophoi that wanders across endless salt flats. The alien feelings come in colours of cyan, magenta, yellow and black, but can merge into hatred, love, longing, all the emotions known to us. Moreover, the Zephyr has physical form, shaping itself into mountains, rivers, plains, as well as living beings. Players play as Windfolk, creatures who live on the periphery of Ophoi, who one day will depart from their communities to fulfill sacred obligations. They use tokens of the four colours to represent the composition of their characters, keeping track of constitution, spending them as energy to overcome challenges, as well as fusing them together to slowly build the sentimental bonds that will shape their identities. The Kickstarter for Zephyr goes live in February, and I highly recommend you check it out. I'm actually incredibly excited for this game after talking to Fede about it. I think the illustrations are beautiful and inspiring. The game mechanics are really different. I've never come across anything like that before, so I'm really excited to try it out. I think Zephyr will have a big impact in the indie RPG community, so please go and support it and check it out. I'll put links to Fede's website, Arcana Media, Zephyr's Kickstarter, and all the relevant links in this episode show notes. All right, well, we'll just start with a very simple and easy, nice question. Who are you and what do you do?
Oh, cool. Hi, I am Fede. I am an Argentinian games designer. I have been making games full-time since around 2017. Basically, originally moved to London to do acting at around 2015. That didn't work out, or kind of like I got sort of like, captured by TTRPGs very early on.
Nice.
So yeah, that's basically who I am. I'm a games designer.
So that's interesting. So you've got like an acting sort of background and stuff, whereas going into RPGs, I think initially, obviously, there's lots of like game mechanics and stuff, but obviously now like improv and acting is quite a big thing. So how did you get started in playing RPGs then, I guess, before, or did you start writing at the same time? Like what's your origin story, I guess, Fede?
The origin story would be probably when I was like 14, 15. I basically found like a website that was super strange because it was about a city. It was kind of like a communal internet project about building a city for Warhammer, and I was super like curious because like I didn't know what RPGs were. Nobody I knew what like those were, and there was this project of people just talking about a fictional city and making articles about neighborhoods and stuff like that. And it was so curious, and it took me a while to realize that this had something to do with gaming,
Right.
and that it had to do with like Warhammer, which was a thing that I didn't know what it was. And I got the manual, and I sat down with a friend, and we barely read any of the rules, but we started playing and kind of getting with the flow. And yeah, that's kind of how it started. Afterwards, I think I didn't role play for a couple of years until I was out of high school and at a job in which like a friend invited me, and we played a lot of like World of Darkness. And from then I just didn't stop playing RPGs.
That's so interesting. Like you sort of came in from it from like a storytelling perspective and that world building thing, and not thinking about necessarily mechanics or like, oh, this is a franchise that I really love. So that's really cool. And I think that's made obvious in sort of your RPGs that you've written about. So if you don't mind, I guess from that moment when you sort of building stuff, were you always playing, or did you suddenly just go, I just want to write? Were you a player and then you're like, no, I want to become a game master, or did you just start writing on the side? Like, what was that sort of process?
I was always playing, and I did like narrating and stuff like that, but it was only after I moved to London and had this idea for a game, which would eventually become Nibiru, that I just started writing. And it was mostly because I had this idea for a mechanic that really captivated me. So it was pretty casual the way I started with it all. It just like turned into like a huge thing very fast. I guess after that.
So Nibiru was your first game, and that's like a
Mhm.
sci-fi game, and there's lots of things about memory and stuff like that. Are you more of a sci-fi person in general? So was that always going to be the starting point, I guess, or do you play lots of different sort of genres, or interested in lots of different genres?
Yeah, I'm not really locked into any genres as long as it conveys ideas that I find interesting, like
Hmm.
anything can be like an avenue to any genre could be an avenue for that. So yeah.
No, fair enough, fair enough. And what I love about that game as well, because obviously that came out a little bit earlier, like was it 2018, I want to say, or 19?
2019 more or
19,
less. Yeah.
more or less, yeah. Because that again, it has some really evocative illustrations as well, as I know Zephyr does as well. But just these, I always find like artwork that can inspire the storytelling. It's so important, especially when we're going through now a big sort of discussion about AI art and like,
Mhm.
do we just need computer generated stuff? And I think looking at the illustrations that you've been using for your books, it's like it's something that's so vast and so different. I don't think sure AI could produce it, but you can definitely see the humanity, I guess, in that sort of thing. So yeah.
I think it's the difference between what like art and just an image.
Mm,
Art, at least for me, it's supposed to convey feelings, the feelings of someone and their emotions and their ideas, which of course is different from like an algorithm
yes.
taking something and chucking out an image. The image can be beautiful, of course, but it's really not the same.
Yeah, and speaking of emotion stuff, let's go on to Zephyr then. So,
Mhm.
for those people who don't know and aren't aware of your workforce, so what is Zephyr, the RPG, and how does it stand out from other RPGs that are out there?
Okay, it stands out in many different ways. Like, first of all, Zephyr is basically an anarchist fantasy game of fleeting identities. It's basically a game that is set in this living continent that just walks and, and goes around. And this continent basically is made of a thing called Zephyr. The Zephyr are the continent's feelings, and they behave like substances. They behave like liquids. They combine into like rivers, mountains, etc. And the interesting thing also about the Zephyr is that it comes in four colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And while those colors, those feelings as individual things, we can't really understand because they're feelings that are just completely unknowable. When they combine, they can create the feelings that we do know, like fury, sorrow, etc. Sort of
Wow.
like color theory, where those colors
Oh,
combine
I
and it
love
can
that. That's
transform
so
into different
cool. Yeah,
things.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in the game, well, everything around you, everything in this land that you're going to journey across is made of this Zephyr, including the living entities and the creatures that you're going to play as, which are the Windfolk. The Windfolk are basically like just creatures that live in the periphery of the continent, like close to the mountains and stuff like that. And they live in small communities. They have different cultures among them, different clans, but they all have a very strong custom surrounding obligations and
Yeah.
the importance of reciprocity and obligations and how these obligations, which are deeply personal, they can't really, it's like a date to the movies. If you can't make it, you can't say someone else to go and go to the movies with your friend or something like that. They have this very strong sort of like organized concept of personal obligation. And so the adventure in this game starts when your Windfolk is big enough, let's say, to take in a large obligation, like a
Mm.
founding obligation with their community. And so they set off to achieve this obligation.
So much to unpack instantly.
Yeah.
So this idea of like a living continent and obviously these emotions becoming sort of like fully formed things. I just everything about that. I'm like, that's so cool because it feels so relevant to sort of right now when you think of stuff like climate change and trying to give like personification to things to
Yes.
make us relate to them. It sounds like a really weird question, but how big are the wind folk? Are they dwarfed by these massive forms of emotion and stuff like that, or are they sort of our size?
Yeah, they're a bit shorter. They're
Bit
like a
shorter.
meter and 20 centimeters more or
Right,
less.
right. So, in a sense, that they are just surrounded by again this sort of sounds like a changing landscape of all these things, and them battling against this sort of amazing unpredictability of it all. I'm instantly like, well, I love that idea. I definitely would watch a TV show or a film on that, like sort of thing. Yeah, and that started this idea of obligation as well. So adding that into that duty as well as this unpredictableness, I just really like that. So with possibly a very stupid question, but I know you said ideas that fascinate you sort of give that inspiration, but were there any sources of inspiration that helped with the setting at all?
Yes, totally. A very strong series of works inspired the book. Mostly, it's been about 2-3 years of studying anthropology, particularly the anthropology of societies and communities outside of states and borders and countries, etc. So a lot of what goes into this book comes from, well, what the main influence, or one of the main influence, is David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, which is a history of debt. And so the difference between debt and obligation that I play around with a lot in the game.
Yeah.
And then other books like James C. Scott's Against the Grain and Seeing Like a State, Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy. There's a wealth of books that I could name that I've basically been reading and rereading for the project, but it's mostly about anthropology.
And I find that quite interesting because, again, I don't know any other RPG that has done that, or at least unaware of that. So instantly, I just feel that instantly more of a connection, or at least I can see that sort of like, oh, I can see my place with it, or I can relate to it more than just say, right, I now go fight a dragon. Right, there are robots coming, you know, that sort of thing. I think for me, sometimes those are maybe one to step away from my understanding, whereas here, I know what my own opinion of what obligation is, or a duty is, and a debt. And so, yeah, I instantly like, oh, this interests me as a player, and I want to find out more about it. So when you're saying about when they go on these not adventures, but going on to fulfill this sense of obligations, of what kind of obligations could you give us some examples of what that could be?
So if you think about it, like most communities, like they self-sustain, they grow their food, they do their stuff like among themselves, and that's fine. But these communities are part of like a larger community of different clans, different cultures, and they do have problems that exceed the normal. You know, there's one thing being like, you know, maybe like borrowing some eggs from like your neighbor or something like that, and going to like a mountain where you have to fix a bridge, for example. That could be a thing. Or maybe there's a landslide that because of a Zephyr storm, it turned living and it's marching through a forest and it's bringing all the trees down or something like that. There can be like so many obligations, but generally the idea of these obligations is that they exceed what would normally be expected of a normal, like a everyday, you know, your neighbor or something that you kind of like act like that. So yeah, that's the idea.
It's one of those things where in all RPGs you need to talk about combat somewhere, but it sounds like to me you, again, please tell me, is there an idea of combat in this game, but is it something that's not as important? No. Amazing. Oh, I'm already 100% in. Was that a deliberate decision then not to include something like that, or to make it a sort of reduced role for that?
Yeah, totally. How relevant is combat like in our everyday lives?
So true. I don't
like I think the most sensible thing is if something is dangerous, like you just run away.
Yeah.
So you know, Windfolk are generally, I'd like to think, quite sensible people that would just run away from anything that's particularly dangerous. There is a system that is about violence, and this is, well, partly done to account for what happens if you fall off a cliff or something like that.
Sure.
In which, like, yeah, you lose tokens, because that's another thing. Like the game doesn't use dice; it uses the tokens of the Zephyr. It uses tokens that are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black.
Oh, very
and
cool.
You have those on your character sheet, and those are the constitution of your character at the time, because there's a lot of like survival aspects in the mechanics. You know, if you push yourself and as you use your energy, you're going to spend those tokens, and to get them back, you have to hunt, for example, or gather and stuff like that, and cook. The cooking is also a big thing in the game. And it's also very important, the combination of tokens that you have, because, for example, if you have all black, or if you have all yellow, or all cyan, or whatever, it means that you don't have, for example, the color combination that your Windfolk would need to express fear or to express love or something like that.
Wow.
because of how the metaphysics of the setting work. So you have to care for that. And in terms of like, for example, violence and stuff like that, well, you would lose tokens if you get hurt or something like that. The interesting thing is also that there's two types of violence. There's the violence that you can incur from nature in that way, and then there's something that is tied to the main antagonists of the game, which are the salt states. The salt states are basically a series of states that happen to be at the center, the geographical center of Ophoi.
Right.
And they have a completely different system of values. They're essentially a sort of like debt-driven, so like ultra capitalist in a way.
Yes, I was going to say capitalism. That's why I see it. Big bad capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, like these salt states, they go into incursions into Windfolk territory, and into these incursions go salt states heroes. These heroes go out after having cashing like years of like toiling at the salt mines. They try to write their legend so they can build a narrative around their conquests in Windfolk land, etc., and come back and become like a lord or something like that. So there's the violence that you can suffer from nature, and then there's heroic violence. So heroic violence is what happens when salt state hero shoots at you or slashes you with their sword or whatever, which basically is different because the emotions and the ideas behind the violence are different. This is what's pushing the shot or the sword slash or whatever is like an ideology. It's an entire worldview. There's intentionality, which is not a thing from like damage from nature or something like that in the eyes of the Windfolk. So when that happens, instead of losing tokens, if you're being shot at, you basically drop tokens in your character sheet and you puncture the character sheet. If you're being slashed, you drop 2 tokens, you draw a line, and you slice your character sheet through that line.
Oh, wow.
So there's a palpable difference of like this idea of systemic violence bleeding out into the world and, changing the character sheet and affecting the materials of play.
I'm a big fan of physical props in general, of being an improviser and stuff. But I love that. Yeah, I love anything that you can do. It impacts on the physicality of a sheet, so everyone can see it. That's such a cool idea. Yeah, because then it is real, but it feels more real than something. So would you advise then people play Zephyr as an in-person physical game over a digital then to get that experience? Or
yes. It's much more of a game to be played like physically.
Well, let's talk about character creation then, if you're happy to. So, like you said, if there's no dice per se or hit points or anything like that, are the characters very similar? Are there I don't want to use the word classes because I know that might be different, but are there differences between, can they choose to be more specialized in a certain way, if you see what I mean?
Yes, definitely. It's a huge part. So basically the first thing that you pick is your clan. There's 4 clans of Windfolk, which is like the Frontier clan, the Wind clan, the Moon clan, and the Earthen folk. They all have like their background, their ideas. They all have different masks. So the Windfolk use masks.
Yes, and you see that in the illustrations as well. So different. Yeah.
Exactly. They all have different cultures. And the idea is that from the moment you pick a clan, you go through a character creation process that is laid out in comic form. And the idea is that you go through 6 different short stories, which are stories that are basically the Windfolk's folklore. And the stories go to a certain point, and at a certain point, you sort of have to decide what your character believes that the story would go on to be.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
And depending on what you pick, you might get like a bonus here, you might get more constitution or whatever, or a particular technology or something like that.
I've never heard of a comic book like that sort of style before. Again, very cool. I love that idea. Again, it feeds into this whole thing that you're bringing across, that these are stories and we are storytellers, and like a story of the obligation and the debt and stuff like that. So I love that that's already in there from the beginning and getting the people into that. So you said so there's 6. So sorry, just to clarify. So is it 6 short stories per clan?
It's 6 short stories for everyone.
For everyone, right? Yeah.
Then there's like traits that depending on the clan, like there's like unique things that are that you get to pick. And then with the rest of the process, once you sort of like finish this idea of building your character based on their outlook on, the folklore of the Windfolk. You go on to build the obligations. So the obligations have their own system, which is, to me, it's kind of neat because it means that it's not the GM that's building the grand adventure and orchestrating like the events, etc. It's the players that are determining their objective. So you have a whole system that basically measures reciprocity through a specific type of points that are called Ophoi, which is it's basically a measure of reciprocity. And the idea is that you go through the parameters of your adventure, so how far you're going to travel, what's at stake, how many people depend on this obligation being fulfilled, what is your relationship to the people that you're basically doing this obligation with for, and you add this up. The heavier the obligation, the more Ophoi you get. And those points of Ophoi that you get, you basically can spend afterwards to get technologies. And technologies are the main thing that you use to build your character.
That sounds like a group collaboration thing. So is that like a pool that that everyone uses, or is it individual?
It's individual. Each Windfolk has their own sort of like major obligation that they want to fulfill. Oh, cool. And they just set out together because like being alone against like the world,
it's dangerous out there.
Yeah, it's really dangerous. And that's another thing when you're doing so even if you do the obligations being sort of like individual, when you think about the technologies that you're getting, you want to think as a group, because you want to have, for example, someone that's particularly good at hunting, one that's particularly good at cooking, one that is particularly good at like pathfinding and stuff like that. So it really depends on how you balance the roles within like the survival game, and how you build the party and think about like what each person is going to carry and stuff like that. So yeah.
How many technologies are there in the game? And like you said,
like when you 50 more or less.
15, and so
50.
50. Yeah, I was like, gosh, I'm sure there's more, but yeah, no, that makes sense. So there's 50 technologies, and they're not, as we would determine technologies, as in like electronics per se. You're saying like they're cooking, and they cover vast areas of expertise. That then feels that is a group collaboration, saying, like you were saying, like, okay, my character, I have more of this Ophoi, so I could do this, this, and this. Does anyone else want to do this? And have that conversation, which I think is so important, because then you have those ties. Whilst you all have your individual obligations and going forward and your duties, this idea that you're working together and being together so you can help each other. I love that as a concept. That's very, very cool.
And the idea is that, of course, like you're looking at the map and planning, okay, like this is the best path to fulfill this guy's obligation first, and then we could travel south and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
Plan the whole thing, because the map is also like a big part of the game.
One thing that I did pick up on from the teaser video that you sort of released in the last couple of days for the Kickstarter, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, this idea that this sentient continent is walking, continue on, which sounds incredible. I can't even fathom like that at all, but I was just like, oh my god, that's amazing. But the idea that it has 4 lungs that give birth to this sort of like multicolored storms. And I know obviously that, like you said, it's tied into the colors and sort of the emotion stuff. So these storms then, they influence the land. So they're not necessarily the big bad, like you were talking before about the center sort of salt heroes as champions. Is that just sort of another element? Is that a bigger role in sort of like the encounters that the Windfolk would face, if you see what I mean?
Yes, weather is an actual thing, like as a system. Like when the sort of like session starts, you have to determine what the weather is depending on the season, because of course, like the seasons are also like a big thing. Like you have one season for each color, which depends entirely on which lung is sort of like exhaling
amazing
out. It's also a pretty big thing, because if you think about it, if a lung is sort of like full to the brim with Zephyr, it means that it pushes the plague upwards. So the entire quarter of the thing is pushed upwards, and you have like rivers that are flowing down, and the mountains start to cover with shadow, like huge swathes of land. So you have like micro winters happening.
Oh my god.
The Earthen Folk, for example, which are one of the clans, have their base at a place which is called the Leaning Citadel, or that wasn't the Bowing Citadel. So the idea is that this Bowing Citadel, which is made of like stone that they carved, but it's bowing to one side. And the idea is that only through one season that citadel sort of like goes upright and they can actually live in it.
Oh, beautiful. That's so cool.
But it's a huge thing because you have entire rivers and lakes that sort of like flow down and become emptied. And you have this shifting rhythm between the four plagues as the one lung inflates and the other deflates and stuff like that. So depending on the season, the weather can change. And that's a thing that tokens are not. So tokens basically happen to be in either on your character sheet or in your region. And the tokens that are in your region, you can interact with. You can harvest them. You can use them to like make changes to the story, like making like a creature pop or like an event happen, etc. So there's interplay. A lot of the times when you're spending tokens, you're moving them from your character sheet to the region, and the players get other choices they can do with those tokens as well. So
amazing. Yeah. You know what? I hadn't even thought that the lungs were part. Like I was like, for me, I'm just like, yeah, I guess they raise up and down. But the idea that at any one time, and I assume it's like a gentle rise and fall rather than a sudden like
it
shoot.
takes like 3 months.
Right.
Yeah, no, it takes like months.
Yeah, because otherwise that would be like, oh no, I can't get into the citadel now, balls, that sort of thing. But yeah, I love that. That means so much because I know before. Again, like you were saying, like obviously the emotions of influence the land and they create these things, but the idea that your ecosystem is constantly changing, like you said, the river's flowing away and then gone and then back again, like to plan for that sort of thing. From a world building perspective, that's such an interest. That's again so different to say than a normal castle, a medieval castle on a hill, where we all have those assumptions and stuff like that. This idea that actually it is the land you need to think about and how that affects the cities. And like you said, this bowing citadel, I'm already in love with it. That sounds incredible.
Yeah, world building wise, it's also like super fun to think of all the implications of it. But because, for example, this land, like the land of Ophoi, is like thoroughly scarred. It's like full of like cracks and because it's land that's constantly moving and shifting, and there's earthquakes and stuff like that. So, for example, how do you build a bridge in this place? Well, there's some bridges that are basically built so that they only connect exactly when there's like a plague that is leaning in.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's like a whole thing where there's like maybe like a salt state outpost next to the river, and that outpost, like the salt state incursions, have to build like a sort of like moat where you have like a separate place where you can dock a ship for when the whole thing empties downriver and stuff like that. So a lot of the logistics of how people move around and animals that travel in herds and how do they deal with this stuff is super fun to write about.
Well, that's actually my next question then. Of course, already I'm invested in this amazing world, so kudos to that. But was there a favorite bit that you wrote and you're like, I guess it's very hard to like pick your favorite bits from something that is already really, really interesting, I'm sure. But was there a favorite bit when you wrote it and you were like, this is what I want people to get excited about, if you see what I mean?
Oh my God, there's a lot.
Was there several things? Yeah, feel free to name drop them all. I'm just curious.
There's lots. I think the idea of like the bridges being a thing that changes depending on like, well, for example, they're like hanging bridges, a thing where like hanging bridges, of course, would be preferred because they kind of like, they can sort of like manage the shifts, and well, the bowing citadel kind of thing. There's so many different aspects. There's aspects that tie to the metaphysics of the setting because you have Zephyr, and then you have a particular material that's called ammonium that is like a colorless thing that just makes things grow. And it has like a huge part in the setting about like there being ammonium in the cracks, and if you see like trees at a particular place that are rising up like really high, like there's probably like ammonium deposits.
That's where it is. So go find that sort of stuff. I like that. There could be absolutely nothing, and suddenly there's like trees and you're like, all right, I know I know what's there. So the flip side to that question, which I appreciate, is a very horrible question. It's like, was there a part that you found maybe difficult to convey, or a challenge, I guess? Was there something that was challenging about writing this that you felt?
Oh yeah, totally. To me, the most complex thing to convey is the very idea of the Zephyr, the idea that there are these feelings, there are alien feelings, and they behave like substances, but at the same time, they can combine into like the feelings that we do know. That sort of thing, to me at the beginning was, and even still now, sometimes, depending on how I word stuff, I find it kind of hard. But I think the fact that I'm using the tokens and that the players are interacting with the very thing just right in front of them, that there are no other elements like dice that they're much more abstract in my in my head when it comes to it. It helps a lot, I think, to convey the metaphysics of the feeling, because you're asking of the players and the readers to like go into kind of like a high level sort of like exercise in this case of like imagining this whole thing, content made of feelings, and it's quite detached, I think, from reality in a way in which, I don't know, it's tough to sort of like convey, but the whole tokens thing helps a lot, I think.
I think it's one of those things where I suspect it's like you have to play it, because I instantly see when you talk about these things, I'm like, I feel like I can relate to that a lot more than, like I was saying before, like fighting dragons or anything like that, just because I'm in touch with my emotions. That's not what I meant, but like I definitely see that more. But I can understand, like, once you play it, going, oh, I get it, just from that. It is fueled, like you were saying, by that collaborative storytelling and by the players using that. That's so cool. For people who want to play or run Zephyr, what would be your big tip or main advice for running a session or a campaign of Zephyr?
If you're going to run Zephyr, I think the fact that the players are going to determine the main goal is something that is good to have in mind, because generally, at least the way I was taught or learned to narrate was sort of like thinking about point A, how everything is started, and point C, and see how that happens. But in here, like, point A is how the game, starts, is determined by the game, and point C is decided by the players. So I think it shifts a bit the role of the narrator. I think that the role of the narrator in this game, you kind of have to use the fact that you don't have the responsibility of determining the lofty goals of the party, but instead try to subvert the narrative in interesting ways. Like, think about how the trip is not going to be as expected, like of the stuff that basically is going to, it's not going to be smooth sailing across the way, and kind of play a bit the trickster part, not in a bad faith kind of thing, but just making it like interesting in ways unexpected. I think that's the advice I would give.
You don't have that responsibility of creating those lofty goals, so you can use that energy elsewhere. Yeah, I appreciate that as a narrator myself, just like, oh god, I got to think of everything, whereas you're being open to that collaboration with the players. Well, we've come to the end of our wonderful interview, Fede, and I'm already so excited. You got me with the illustrations, and now I'm in both the emotions, the bowing citadel. I'm totally in. So where can we find out more about your work? Tell us about the Kickstarter for Zephyr, and what can we expect from that, or from you and obviously your company in the next year or so. I appreciate you've probably been working all on this, so you want to get it all out, but if there's anything else coming up, please let us know. This is your time to shine.
So you can find me on the Oricana Media Twitter. That's my company. The Twitter is Oricana1. In the Oricana.com website, there's also like newsletter and stuff like that. And from the Kickstarter, you can basically, it's starting now on February the 1st, and you can expect the box of the game to be box. It comes with the tokens, the book, and a couple of maps. So everything that you need to play basically comes in the box. What can you expect from me? Like, I'll just most of my time will be just drawing for Zephyr, because it takes a lot of like illustration work. Yeah. So yeah, I'll spend most of my time drawing and writing and stuff like that. So yeah.
Is there like a Discord or anything like that where people can come together and talk about it and share their
totally.
designs? Brilliant. All right, cool.
There's also a Discord.
Cool. I will put a link to that in the episode show notes as well, because obviously we'll signal boost everything like that. Oh, Fede, honestly, you've made my Monday. I'm so excited. I'm so excited for this game. It's everything I want in indie RPGs. I think at a time now where RPGs, there's a lot of discourse happening just now. It kind of sucks the joy out of it when you hear about these sort of things. But stuff like this, instantly I'm interested. When can I play it? What's going on? So no, thank you for sharing Zephyr. I can't wait for the Kickstarter, and best of luck with it. I'm sure. Obviously, it's going to be a success. It's about emotions.
Yeah.
I'm invested. But yeah, no, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Thanks for having me.
I'm hoping to do more of these special Q&A bonus episodes in future, including Q&As on the one-shots we've done here at What Am I Rolling? If you have a question or think of an RPG designer you would like to see interviewed on this podcast, let us know. Our email address is whatamirollingpodcast@gmail.com. And that's it. Great. See you next time.